Hello and welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Lyu Xiang. In this series, we dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join us in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN app, email us at thepoint with alex@cgtn.com. Let us know what you think. We start our live streaming every Friday at 11 a.m. Beijing time. Get in touch, and we just might read out your comments. This year marks the 70th anniversary of China's response to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's request to join the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea. 2.9 million Chinese People's Volunteer soldiers fought in the war, and almost nearly 200,000 of them lost their lives on the battlefield, according to official numbers. It is a somber anniversary, one that no country, including China, wants to repeat. Nevertheless, some media are making it sound as if China is gunning for another war with the U.S. China wants to honor its soldier sacrifices, yes, and it wants to protect its national interests and defend itself if necessary. But to suggest that China wants to start another war probably belies the reality. Before we look at our examples, a bit of background here about what the war was all about and why it still mattered today. Let's turn the clock back to Asia in the aftermath of the World War II. That is a map of the East Asia you see over there. On the Korean Peninsula, which had been occupied by Japan during the war, was divided into two parts after Japan surrendered to the Allied troops, after which two separate countries, the DPRK, also known as North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, also known as South Korea, with two ideologically opposed systems, were established. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War broke out. A few days later, U.S. President Harry Truman ordered ground troops into action by making the United Nations Security Council to adopt a resolution on dispatching a UN force to the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. was able to mobilize a third of its army, half of its navy, and a fifth of its air force to join the fight. Its peak troop strength topped 300,000. 3 months later, U.S. military planes intruded into China's airspace, bombing airports and infrastructure along the China-DPRK border. In October 1950, after that, as requested by the DPRK, China decided to join the fight. The fighting raged on for 3 years. Truce talks, which began in 1951, lasted 2 years and 17 days. By July 1953, the DPRK, China, and the United Nations troops signed an armistice agreement in Panmunjom at the demilitarized zone, but the ROK refused to sign. Although hostilities ended within 12 hours, there has never been a formal peace treaty. So technically, the war never ended. So why should we care now? Tensions still run deep between the two Koreas and between the DPRK and the U.S., which have seen dramatic fluctuations in their communication since U.S. President Donald Trump and DPRK leader Kim Jong-un first met in Singapore in June 2018. They met again, of course, in the demilitarized zone. China-U.S. friction has also been building on a number of fronts, from Hong Kong to Xinjiang to Huawei, to TikTok, and of course, on the issue of the South China Sea. But to be clear, just because the China-U.S. relations is under stress doesn't necessarily mean that China is looking for a war with the U.S. In the 1950s, the relationship between the two countries was in a very different place. 70 years later, China and the U.S. are linked now by diplomacy, trade, people-to-people connections, and many multilateral organizations. Nobody wants a war right now, especially as the world fights against a far more elusive common enemy, COVID-19. But when you read some of the media reports out there, you get the impression that China is baiting the U.S. into a war, using the 70th anniversary as a provocation or warning to the U.S. that it is ready to start the war if needed. Are these reports accurate? Before we look at our examples, let's set the stage. Along the Yalu River, from the North Korean town of Sinuiju, is the Chinese city of Dandong. A modest memorial sitting on the hilltop in Dandong is one of the few places in China where people can pay tribute to their loved ones who entered the war and never returned. After a long period of renovation, the memorial reopened again to the public in late September, ahead of the 70th anniversary of the war. When Chinese President Xi Jinping visited an exhibition commemorating the anniversary at China's Military Museum in Beijing, he spoke highly of the heroic deeds and revolutionary spirit of the CPV Army, and also urged to make more contributions to safeguarding world peace and promoting the building of a community of shared future. Now, taking a moment to mark the anniversary of the war and to honor the soldiers who fought and died for it is not unique to China. Many, if not all, world leaders do that. But somehow when China hosts this kind of event, it gets spun into something else. Certain media outlets are so sly at hyping up and speculating over the political significance of an otherwise ordinary tribute to the deceased heroes by a country's leader. And this time, the political significance they assign to it is of an anti-American and anti-West xenophobic kind. A recent piece published by The Diplomat is a case in point. The headline reads, "Xi Jinping demands more focus on the war to resist American aggression." Amid the worst downturn in China-U.S. relations in decades, Xi Jinping highlights the one actual conflict fought between the two sides, the Korean War. It says, while attending an exhibit on China's involvement in the war, President Xi Jinping said, "The victory in the war to resist U.S. aggression was a victory of justice, a victory of peace, and a victory of the people." He added that the spirit forged during the war will inspire the Chinese people and the Chinese nation to overcome all difficulties and prevail over all enemies. Let's face it, interpreting praises of the sacrifices made by a country's soldier as a provocation of war with another country is far-fetched. According to the article, something much more sinister is at play here. It says Xi did not specifically mention what enemies China might be facing today, instead focusing on the figurative battle for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But the subtext was obvious from the literal backdrop to his remarks. The United States, that past enemy, looms large as a present villain. I mean, perhaps the subtext is obvious to someone who already has a predetermined verdict in mind. In recent years, the U.S. has increased pressure on China on multiple fronts, yes, but China most of the times responded in kind and has never really expressed any intent to pick a real fight, a war, with the U.S. The fact is, as China's foreign minister put it, China has never provoked a war or conflict, nor has it ever invaded another country or taken a territory over the past 70 years since its founding. How many wars has the U.S. fought in the meanwhile? Our next example makes great claims based on questionable evidence. A recent New York Times article says China ramps up a war of words, warning the U.S. of its red lines. The article is a hodgepodge of tenuously related events connected together to make an impression, a theme, and a narrative that China is turning bellicose and hostile to the West. It talked about a few documentary-style defense-related videos appearing on the internet. It talked about a new Korean War movie featuring Wu Jing, who was the lead actor in another action movie, Wolf Warrior. When you look up how many Hollywood movies have been made about the Korean War, do you know how many are there? 50. Not to mention one of the most popular TV series, which ran from 1972 to 1983, MASH. How many Korean War movies are there in China? 5. If 5 movies and some amateurish internet videos constitute what the New York Times called a torrent of bombast online and in state media, America's 50 movies and the TV series running a span of 2 decades qualifies as a propaganda tsunami. The point here is that commemorating the people who fought in the war is not the same as wanting another war. China and the U.S. have reconciled on this tragic period of their history. Both countries have moved on and developed strong connections. But that doesn't mean we should forget about our past and our loved ones who never returned. War should not be repeated, but the spirit of peace live on. With that, we'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll ask our guests what message they think China is sending with its 70th anniversary of this event, and if media is misinterpreting those messages. Welcome back, guys. I want to bring in our guests for today's discussion. They are Lyu Xiang, Research Fellow at Chinese Academy of Social Science, and Goodrum, Senior Editor and columnist at China Daily. And last but not least, Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, President of Grasshopper Strategies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Brandon, let me start with you. China is celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Korean War in a grand style. Is Beijing sending a message, and if so, to whom?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that this is standard business, okay? No one accused the United States of picking a diplomatic or military fight with Germany when they observed the 70th anniversary of D-Day. No one has questioned the ability of any country in the world to honor its fallen soldiers, and particularly an event as deadly as the Korean War, I believe it deserves multiple memorials, including many that have happened in the United States and around the world. The problem is, I don't think it's just that simple, right? Nothing is ever that simple. In Asia particularly, when we've seen entire diplomatic rifts that have lasted months, if not years, between countries because leaders of one country went to a certain shrine, we always have to see what is the broader message, what is the broader context. And the reality is the broader context comes at a time of heightened tensions between the United States and China, comes at a time of questionable relations across the Korean Peninsula, and come alongside a number of other questionable actions on both the United States and the Chinese media's parts to stoke concerns on all sides. So at its core, there's nothing wrong with this memorial. At its core, every country should be able to celebrate its fallen heroes, celebrate its past, memorialize, and hope for a world where we do not need destructive wars like this, but it's never that simple.
Mr. Liu, what do you think? What are the significance and also the messages that China is trying to send by memorializing this event?
Oh yes, Wang Guan. I just watched the live speech of President Xi, and actually I have some personal affection to this kind of commemoration because, you know, my father was a soldier in the Korean Peninsula at that time, from 1952 to even after the war, he was there until 1956. So from my childhood, I heard a lot about this war. It was the largest scale war between the new China and a foreign force. And it still left a lot of experience and lessons and messages to us. You know, it means, to me, it means two things. First, China will never, the new China, the People's Republic of China will never be compromised by the bullying and provocation or even aggression from a foreign force. At that time, you know, actually the decision to cross the Yalu River was the most difficult decision since the founding of the new China, because that time, you know, China was very weak. Our army, we only have our army, and we don't have air force. We didn't have navy. So and we were facing a very strong aggressor, but the leadership made a very difficult decision and send our troops to the peninsula and to assist the Korean people and resist the strong army. So even today, it's a signal for China that now we are much stronger than that time, but compared with the United States, we are still weaker. But even if we are weaker, we are not afraid of a fight. But although we will never pick a fight. So that's the message. The second message is that China actually has a responsibility for the security in the surrounding countries of our country. So, you know, the war broke out in Korea, but it was a very great threat to our security. So China needs to take care of that. So today, this is the same. In the South China Sea, in other areas around our country, if there occurs kind of unrest or kind of war or any kind of conflict, yeah, China is not an outsider. So this is the message I got from President Xi's speech.
Right. Ian, how do you look at this? What are the messages that you have picked up?
Well, I mean, it's true that it's a standard remembrance, as Brandon said, but we have to consider the context that Mr. Lyu also referred to, because this was not, you see, the myth of foreign aggression is the foundational myth of U.S. foreign policy. The idea that there is some enemy out there preparing to strike, preparing to attack, animates practically every decision made by the U.S. government. It's used to justify all kinds of preemptive attacks. It's used to justify all kinds of invasions, all kinds of sanctions, all kinds of violations of sovereignty. And the context of this cannot be removed from the context of the broader history in which the U.S. has engaged itself. The Korean War, the Chinese name being the War to Resist U.S. Aggression and Aid Korea, it's a very accurate name. Because we remember that the division itself along the 38th parallel was a decision by the U.S. military. And the creation of a U.S. military government in the South and the propping up of an unpopular government in the South and in the constant threats of invasion and aggression from the South to the North animated the conflict and created the tensions that led to the war itself. So considering that, we have to understand that any commemoration of this particular war, this represents, as do many of the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, this resistance to the imposition of American will on sovereign nations, the imposition of U.S. rules and U.S. strictures on countries that might want to go their own way, as Korea was doing before the division happened. So this obviously has a lot of resonance right now. It has a lot of resonance. It has for the last 100 years, the last 70 years, the PRC's history. It will always be relevant. But the fact of the matter is, these attempts to gin up the idea of Chinese aggression are based on practically nothing. We have to remember, as you referred to earlier, that China has not willfully invaded another country, and it's been 40 years since Chinese military has been in open armed conflict with another country. 40 years.
Yeah, 41 years to be exact.
The relevant point here is that in the United States' 244-year history, there have only been 18 years at which the U.S. was not at war at some point during that time. So that's less than half the amount of time since China was last in armed conflict throughout the entire almost 250-year history of the United States. So who's the aggressor in this scenario? That's what we have to ask ourselves.
May I jump in here?
Yeah, Brandon, pick it up.
I mean, I'm fascinated by a couple of different things here. Let's get the history correct. First of all, prior to the division that was apparently engineered by the U.S. military, which it wasn't, South Korea and North Korea, the Korean Peninsula, were run by the Japanese since 1910. Because it had been so long since the Japanese had taken over the Korean Peninsula, there was no government in exile. So we basically removed 700,000 Japanese citizens from the Korean Peninsula, leaving behind a vacuum of power. It was not the U.S. military that made the decision. It were great powers, including the Soviet Union, who took over administration of the northern half and agreed upon the division of the country. They then helped.
You're leaving out a very key point. You're leaving out a very key point here.
Ian, thank you. We're looking at a situation where Kim Il-sung, during this period, was a major in the military. He wasn't even an influential player on the field who eventually rose to run North Korea. We then have a period of mutual tensions building, and we have the Northern Korean forces under Kim Il-sung invading the South. We then have the U.S. pushing back to 30th parallel, pushing into the North, which then triggered the Chinese to enter, which then pushed the United States back into the South with Chinese forces invading the South. And then we have the line reestablished about the 30th parallel. So this is one of these wars that no one likes to talk about, because the United States doesn't like to admit that it invaded the South, in the North. We don't like to admit that. We also don't like to admit that we got pushed back twice. The Chinese don't like to talk about the fact that they pushed past the 38th parallel and then got pushed out of South Korea. It's one of these wars about the fact that, hey, we all had justification on our side. No one really likes how it ended, except for the fact that it ended, because it stopped the killing of civilians.
Well,
interesting. Interesting. I went to South Korea in 2008. North Korea, actually, and the North Koreans told me that the South fired the first shot, but being in the U.S. for the past 8 years, the narrative is largely surrounding, Kim Il-sung fired the first shot, but there's very different, narratives out there, certainly disputed.
Again, where were the troops? The troops from the North had almost completely pushed UN South Korean forces out of the Korean Peninsula. So that's fact, right? So if you're looking at who crossed the line, that was the fact. Now let's fast forward.
I think both sides crossed the line at some point, and the North was having the momentum. They had their moments, right? But then, with help of the U.S. troops, it pushed all the way to the China DPRK border, to the town of Sinuiju, which I've also been in 2009. Let's put history aside, folks. Of course, there are many versions of history. China's Global Times. I want to ask Mr. Lyu. China's Global Times argues that the U.S. failed to figure out the message from the Chinese side, meaning, 60, 70 years ago during the Korean War, that China will not sit still if the U.S. Army crossed the 38th parallel. It has also underestimated China's determination to safeguard its national security. So, Mr. Lyu, do you think this is a message to Washington that don't mess with China, don't mess with South China Sea, don't mess with Taiwan?
Okay, so first, let me talk a little about the origins of the war. Actually, first of all, the war between the North and the South was a civil war, and before that, there had been a lot of conflicts between the two parties. But no matter what it was, it's a civil war. Actually, China didn't want to intervene into that civil war. Only after the U.S. forces and the force of the U.S. and some allies closer to the Chinese border, we send our troops there to fight the war. So that's the essence of the Chinese involvement in the Korean Peninsula. So in today's conflict, it's very clear some elements in the United States are trying to drag China into kind of conflict, whether it's in the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait or even the Northeast Asia.
Brandon, it looks like you're also, passionate about history. So am I. Let's talk about President Harry Truman. Why would he send the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait once, China decided to join the fight? Is that a strategic miscalculation? I mean, he thought about the domino effect and the fact that China, once joining the fight, can be linked to the Soviet Union, under the Soviet umbrella. Is that a, exaggeration of the situation? Is that a strategic miscalculation by Harry Truman?
Sending the fleet to the Taiwan Strait, I don't think was a miscalculation. Everyone was making moves. China was relatively unknown power at the time. China massively upgraded its military over an incredibly short period of time, performed, I think, objectively from the military perspective, much better in the fight than the United States had thought was going to happen. Both sides sort of underestimated and overestimated each other at both times. Hence, a battle that went back and forth across the peninsula 2 and 3 different times. That's an element. Whether individual steps were a misstep, if I was going to pick one, I wouldn't go with the 7th Fleet. I would pushing to go past the 38th parallel. The United States had simply stopped at 38th parallel after the initial invasion. I think we'd be talking about a very different Asia today.
I mean, Ian, what do you think? Do you agree?
Well, I just want to circle back for a second because Brandon was suggesting a sort of unbroken line between Japanese occupation and the division of Korea by the Soviet civil administration and the U.S. military government. What we actually had was we had a brief period when the Japanese left where the Koreans were self-actualizing and creating what were these kind of quasi or proto-governmental units called people's committees in both the North and the South. Now, the difference between what happened when both militaries went into the peninsula was these committees were as I said, these proto-governmental units that were laying the groundwork for a provisional government that was known as the People's Republic of Korea. Now, when the U.S. came in, they got rid of those people's committees and they established their own structure. When the Soviets came in, structure relatively intact. So that's the difference, I think, in terms of what we're talking about with the division. That's what I was referring to. As far as what Brandon was discussing, I mean, he mentions MacArthur. It's interesting to me also because MacArthur at one point was jostling or jockeying or whatever word you want to use to potentially use nuclear weapons in the North, potentially in parts of China.
Yeah, he was stopped, barely stopped by Harry Truman, who was at odds with him.
Right, exactly. So we were that close to another use of nuclear weapons in armed conflict, which I will remind everyone, the United States is the only country to do that in the history of the world. It does not have no first use policy. So when we're talking about how the history of this conflict fits into how we broadly understand geopolitics and international relations, certainly past is prologue, and certainly we can take some hints, but it's interesting to see how the kind of messaging of these conflicts gets manipulated and twisted to serve specific interests. So inconvenient facts are ignored. Convenient facts are emphasized. So as I say, I agree with Brandon that I don't think there was some original sin in the conflict, but I do think that there is a certain element of narrative building that takes place in the West that should be reckoned with if we're to have an honest conversation about this and other conflicts.
Dr. Lyu, I saw you nodding your head over there. What do you think?
Yes, actually, we have to note that the U.S. government that time, especially the military leader in Asia, MacArthur, underestimated and he fatally ignored China's warnings. Strategically speaking, China was very transparent at that time. Chairman Mao and Prime Minister Zhou gave a lot of warnings to the U.S. If you crossed the 38 parallel, we will send our troops. We will be involved. We will send our troops. So that they didn't pay any attention. They thought that's bluffing. So that's a fatal mistake on the U.S. side. So for the Chinese part, on the Chinese part, strategically we are transparent, but technically, actually we did a lot of preparations.
What do you think the lessons of the Korean War can inform the current policymakers, leaders in Beijing and Washington?
Yeah, for the Washington strategic decision makers, it's very clear. Stop any kind of imagination. The U.S. can bully China now. Yeah, now, just as I said, even if we are strategically we are weaker in terms of the overall capabilities, we are weaker than the U.S. But we will never be compromised by any kind of bullying, by any kind of aggression actions. So that's the most clear message to the U.S. government.
All right, guys, thank you so much. Fascinating discussion. Ian, Brandon, and Dr. Lyu, thank you all so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Wang Guan.
Thank you, thank you. Then that will do it for this edition of Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. Thank you all so very much for tuning in. I'll hopefully see you next week. Thank you so much.